The supply chain is not one thing. It's a social organism. It's a social construct that's made up of people and assets who are trying to work in harmony to do really three things: move goods and products, ensure we have proper exchange of finances when those goods and products change hands, but more importantly, make sure we have the appropriate and efficient flow of information related to those transactions in a more timely manner.
So I'd like to welcome everybody to this edition of Smarter Sourcing. My name is John Pavia, and today we are lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Randy Bradley, Associate Professor of Supply Chain and Information Systems at the University of Tennessee. And Randy, thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
Pleasure to be with you, John.
So just before we actually started recording here, I wanted to make sure I had Randy's. You're doing so many things, and I want to make sure you have a lot of different titles depending on what you're doing. But this is your primary. But even here, I wanted to make sure I got it right, and then I think I got it right the way I said it. And now, but there's about to be a change, right? So tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So effective June 1st, I will be the Dean of the Jack C. Massey College of Business at Belmont University and the Professor of Supply Chain Management.
That's amazing. That's been congratulations. So prepare for this interview. I put a lot of thought into how I wanted to start it off, and I'm going to start off in a way that's probably atypical for these interviews, in that I'll usually tell a personal story somewhere in the middle, but I'm going to tell it at the beginning because it leads into my question. That is, years and years ago, I was working in London for a couple of years, and I was sitting one night and having dinner at the place, my favorite restaurant that was right around the corner from where I was staying. And then this guy sits next to me and he starts talking to me. And I was like, oh, I didn't feel like talking to anybody. And he says, so what do you do? And I tell him, and this is about 20 years ago. And what do you do? And he goes, I aggregate intellectual property. And I'm like, what does that even mean? And he starts telling me how he takes out his flip phone and he says, see all these different figures? He goes, you blokes over in the US, you're not doing it yet, but all these teens over here, they're sending these little icons and little pictures, and then they're sending each other messages on their phone. So I'm collecting the legal rights to all these little icons. And so I'm sitting there and I say to myself, okay, this guy's a moron. He's going to go, whatever he's doing, he's going to go broke. He wasn't a moron. I was the moron. And I don't know whatever happened to the guy, but if he's a billionaire today, I wouldn't be surprised. But the reason I start off this interview with that story is because I look at your resume and I usually tell people, so tell us about your personal journey. How did you get from where you were to where you are today? And I look at your background and I want to know, as you tell your personal story, to weave into it, how did you have the foresight to see where the world was going to be going? Because when I look at your background, to me, you are someone who 20 years ago said, man, it's going to be all about data sharing, monetizing your data, and effectively sharing your data. And the world better start really getting focused on this, which we are now. But 20, 25 years ago, when you really, I think, the light bulb had already gone on for you. How did that happen? Because that's what I was really curious about as I was reading about your background.
I wish I could say that I had the foresight to know that it was going to come to this, but I really didn't. But I can tell you, for me, where it all started as an engineering major who didn't want to do anything engineering related. I knew even in my early days that I wanted to go into consulting. And that's rare for an engineer, because oftentimes we're the people who can only look down at our shoes. At least that's what people say about us. But yet I had this ability to communicate with people and explain very complex topics in a more simplistic way, so that, as I say, the person on the street could understand it. And what that led me to is doing internships in consulting firms, even as an engineering undergraduate. And then when I went into industry as a systems engineer, it was a misnomer, because I wasn't doing engineering. I was the liaison between our shop floor for manufacturing, our business analysts, and then the external consultants that we had to come in to advise us. So the one thing that I could see that was central to all of that is I had a knack for identifying problems and solving them. And so when I transitioned out of manufacturing, I went into IT consulting. And what I learned, or what I identified, is that it's all about, one thing I've learned over the years, John, is this: people will pay you for one of two things. They will pay you for what you know, or they will pay you for what you can do. And the things that I've learned is the time will come where you will no longer want to do it. So you better know something and know something that people are interested in. And so for me, I built my entire career around solving problems that matter to others. And so really, when I look at this world of emerging supply chain technology and IT, I was more pragmatic when I started to pursue a PhD. I remember my consulting days and said, wait a minute, the industries that I remember servicing that had the greatest problems but didn't really have a clue how to solve it was healthcare. So when I started to focus on my PhD around at the time, what we call enterprise, or it was really called IT architecture, which not many people in the College of Business was interested in that, and very few were even interested in looking at healthcare. But I saw that as really the core of it all.
What time frame are we talking about here?
So we're talking about now the late 90s all the way up to maybe the early 2000s when I started my PhD. And so by that time, it was like, okay, healthcare has a problem, but I don't see where we're solving it. I see that we're putting patchwork in place. And so I knew that I wanted to do something that had a tremendous societal impact, but at the same time, it had to be academically rigorous. So for me, let's look at how we make strategic decisions around technology. And then while seeing that, I began to see this convergence of technology into other functional areas. There were already people who were looking at it from a marketing and HR was just HRIS was just on the fringe. But really, for me, it was really looking more from an operations management and a supply chain standpoint. So I didn't restrict myself to traditional information and communication technologies. I wanted to look at technologies across the board that would affect an organization and how those leaders made decisions.
So I guess, and that's perfect, because as I was looking at this, I'm saying, boy, he had this, just the time frame that you just described, right? 90s, early 2000s. That's over 25 years ago that you start seeing the gap, the white space in the marketplace, and in the economy. But on the other hand, those are like two different things in a way, but you saw them together, which was, the IT architecture, enterprise, and things like supply chain management, HR, health, right? And somehow you also then see in the epiphany of converging. You just said the convergence of the importance of your enterprise and all aspects of your business. And I guess that's were you on a job somewhere? Were you on an assignment, or was this more of a gradual epiphany?
I think it was a gradual. I did have the benefit of working with a great academic advisor, Dr. Terry Bird, who's now retired, but also Dr. Jeannie Ross, who at the time was at the MIT Center for Information Systems Research. And I would spend time talking to both of them, and more so Jeannie, about what I wanted to do career-wise, which is I didn't want to be the traditional academic where I went in, I taught my classes, and I researched things that most people in the industry could care less about. And she told me the day will come where you have to make a decision. You have to choose sides. And the reason is because writing for those two audiences is very different, and both are very difficult. But for me, I have never been the type of person where I viewed the world as an or. It's almost always an and. It's just that we don't want to tackle the and because it's dirty, it's complex, and it's challenging. And as a colleague once said, nothing about my career has been sort of traditional. And part of this is because I said, let's do the hard work that people really aren't interested in doing. So I think part of it is the epiphany over time. But I think the other part is just my personality in terms of what my makeup is, which is my mother used to tell me this, you either do it right or you get to do it again. And I wasn't interested in continuing to do things again. So let's figure out how to get it right. And what I began to realize is the stories from all the clients I worked with around the world began to resonate with other leaders and other executives. So I began to pivot and say, you know what, I'm no longer in big box consulting. I'm now academia. So let me stand up my own consulting and public speaking firm where I can get out there, not just talk about what I'm doing in the classroom, but talk about how I can help those who are boots on the ground solve extremely complex problems that they have no choice but to solve.
So you write a lot about viewing supply chain. Let's connect this to specifically to supply chain and smarter sourcing. And you've written quite a bit and you speak quite a bit about viewing supply chain as a strategic asset. And so that makes sense when you hear that. My question to you is, give us examples of, and you don't have to use names, you can use names, not use names, but what does it mean not to view your supply chain as a strategic asset?
It's interesting you asked that because when I work with executives, one of the first questions I ask them is how many of them view their supply chain as a strategic asset. And I do that without defining it. And what I find is more than 80% of them will tell me they view it as a strategic asset. And then I flip the question and I say, tell me this, is your supply chain expected to contribute to the bottom line? Meaning, does it help to drive revenue or actually more top line, if you will? And they'll say, no, the only purpose is to drive down costs. And I say, well, you know what? That's not a strategic asset. That's a commodity. Because in most other organizations, in most other sectors, a strategic asset is something that either has its own P&L or contributes to the top line of the business. It's not about save me money here so I can go do other things. Because the other part of that about being a strategic asset is it a corporate capability? Meaning, is there a skill set, a talent, and a knowledge base that we can leverage beyond the functional area where it sits? And that's the thing, because let's take hospitals. Okay. You got a hospital, you've got linen services, you've got all types of food services, you have medications and things that have to move. You even have clinicians who go throughout the hospital. But the interesting thing about this, John, is very few people take the time to map the route or the time of day. Oftentimes, those services are performed at times when it's either convenient to the person doing it or it's based on habit that organizations have developed over the years. But yet you've got supply chain and logistician experts in your organization that you don't even task to help you think about optimization of flow. We'll go out and look at a consulting firm, but we've got that knowledge base right here in-house. That's what I mean about looking at it as a strategic asset and a corporate capability where we can leverage in any area of our business.
How many consulting, and again, this is a sort of a generic question, but not how many, but do consulting firms, generally speaking, do they come in and say with the mindset of, hey, you need to look at your supply chain as a strategic asset? Because I haven't found that. I just to be honest, I mean, the best consulting firms in the world, I just don't think, in my experience, that I've come into contact with a lot of these folks who come in with that message.
I agree. It was not common. I think it's more common now, but only in select firms. And so what I say, think about the vast majority of consulting firms. They primarily have been management consulting. They have not really been focused on specific functional areas as much as how do we give you a framework to make strategic decisions and then measure the value of those decisions that you're making. It's not digging down into those tactical operational elements of your business. But we do have some consulting firms now that have a supply chain and operations division, or some that say, let's look at finance and operations. There are not a lot of them, but those who do, I don't know that they use the verbiage of looking at supply chain as a strategic asset, but if you look at the habits and practices that they're driving, that's what they're trying to bring to the top. We saw this more so during the time of COVID, where all of a sudden, people who didn't even know what supply chain was started to talk about it. And some of them, frankly, they were in error because they didn't understand it. The biggest challenge, though, that I've seen now, John, is now that things have we've gotten a new normal, then what has happened is we've reverted back to our old practices and old habits. And so supply chain, mostly in healthcare systems, is back to where it used to be, in the basement next to the morgue. I always say supply chain and healthcare is where things go to die because we're not tapped with innovating. We're not asked to drive and create opportunities for new services that would actually generate revenue and improve the experience of the patients. But that's what we have to get to in this next era.
So I always laugh when it comes to supply chain and the pandemic, because it was I compare it back to when, and it's bad comparison probably, but when Bill Clinton got impeached and there was the scene of the Chief Justice coming over to the Congress to do the trial of the president. And for many Americans, it was the first time they're like, oh, wow. Like, so that's what the three branches of government and what impeachment means. And it was like a civics lesson for everybody who probably learned it when they were in 8th grade, but didn't, they were sleeping in class. And there were so many people saying, wow, how does this actually work? Well, fast forward to the pandemic, and the amount of people that all of a sudden were asking, so like, I understand the term supply chain disruption, or disrupting the worldwide supply chain. What does that really mean? And it was the first time for many people that they were actually putting time into thinking, what does that term actually mean? So when you must have got that question 1,000 times during the pandemic, what would your answer be to someone who is not from this world?
That a supply chain is not one thing. It's a social organism. It's a social construct that's made up of people and assets who are trying to work in harmony to do really three things: move goods and products, ensure we have proper exchange of finances when those goods and products change hands, but more importantly, make sure we have the appropriate and efficient flow of information related to those transactions in a more timely manner. And if you think about what we saw during COVID, we saw all of that disrupted. And that's what made it so impactful, is that a lot of times we'll see one of these elements, or maybe even two, where they flounder, but they rebound. But when all three major aspects of a supply chain are affected, then in this case, we say only the strong survive. It wasn't really true, because a lot of times people still confuse the terms agility and resilience. And my whole thing is this: on one vantage point, you are able to withstand the challenge and you come out on the other side. The difference is with the other one is not only do you come out, but you come out better, because you come out with new capabilities that you had to develop as you went through. And so I tell people resilience is nothing more than a reaction, whereas agility is a strategy. And so when you begin to think about those things, I often tell organizations, what do you want to be? Do you want to be resilient, or you want to be agile? Both deal with the unexpected, but only one changes you.
That's a great point. That's a better description than I would get. I would use the Milton Friedman example, where he holds up the pencil and he would say, now let's talk about what's required to make this pencil and how many different companies, are vendors and what suppliers. So when you think about, you said there's a new normal, and everybody I talk to who's in the supply chain world, sourcing and procurement, so many of them have gone from, because of the pandemic, they went from sort of the, one of the offices on the lower floors, and now they have a seat at the table. And the CEO wants to make sure there's redundancy and there's, everything that there should be around any company's supply chain. Have you experienced that personally? And are you amazed at the amount of people that are in this profession who have said that their role has, and the profile that they're getting inside their companies have dramatically changed?
I would agree with that. I will say that the roles have been elevated. The profile, now we see more chief supply chain officers, particularly if we look at healthcare, than we've seen in the past. Other industries had really led the way with regard to, particularly in retail and consumer packaged goods and fast moving consumer goods. We saw it there. But healthcare was the one that really where we began to lag. And I want to go to something you said about having a seat at the table, because for so long, chief supply chain officers or supply chain leaders in healthcare wanted a seat, but they lost sight of the fact that what good is it to have a seat if you don't have a voice? And if you have a voice, who's going to listen? And so one of the things that we work with supply chain leaders is this: how do you speak a language that others speak, but they don't understand the language that you're fluent in? And so it's how do you translate the operational things that matter to you, but the CEO could care less about? And so if you're talking to me about inventory turns, okay, great. But the CEO may not even know what it means to turn a group of inventory. So what he or she does understand is this: what does that mean for my top line and my bottom line? What does that mean for my working capital? What does that mean in terms of me being able to shift funds in one area to another area to focus on capital projects? And so the burden is on the supply chain leader to now translate or do a crosswalk. This number of turns means that we reduce our inventory carrying costs, which means it frees up this amount of capital, which gives you the flexibility to do X, Y, Z. That's what we're trying to get supply chain leaders in healthcare to do. But right now, we're so focused on the operational measures and metrics to the point that no one other than us cares about that. There was one former executive who said this: I will give my supply chain leader 30 minutes a month, but in each month, they have to earn the next month. Meaning that if this month, that 30-minute conversation isn't valuable, you may not get that 30 minutes next month. Because I hear what you're saying. It's just that what you're saying doesn't resonate with me, because it's not on the radar of things I need to be focused on.
Yeah, that's all. I have 4 children, and plus I teach law. But something I've said to my kids and to my students all the time is, if you haven't taken enough business courses to understand how to read a P&L statement, a balance sheet, cash flow statement, you should go back and do it, because I don't care what you're doing in whatever role, whatever your occupation is, whatever kind of company you work in, understanding how what you do impacts the top and bottom line, and then being able to explain it to your boss and to your colleagues it's invaluable. And I think that's what you're saying, because a lot of times that's all that the CEO and the CFO are going to really understand when they're talking to the head of, procurement, supply chain, whatever.
Right, exactly. I can think back to 2017. I was at a conference. I won't name the vendor, but it was their annual conference, and they were talking about the pathway for the evolution of their software solution. And at that time, they were demoing a product, and it was called "Tell Me About My Business." And the whole premise was that a CEO will walk in the morning, speak to his or her computer and say, tell me about my business. And it will basically go through all the data about the business, looking through the emails and all the transactions and say, these are the top 5 things that require your attention today. Now think about this. We weren't talking about generative AI at the time, but isn't that not what we're trying to leverage generative AI to help us do? Well, yeah, that was in 2017, and that was on the roadmap of an enterprise software solution provider.
Yeah. So let me move the conversation forward a little bit and talk about getting your supply chain to the point where it is being treated and it is a strategic asset for a company. And you talk about the vital necessity of advanced internal and effective data sharing and the 3 requirements for that, which, and I'm reading here, relevant liquid data assets or creating relevant data liquid assets, becoming proficient in data monetization, and developing highly engaged data democracies. So those are all, I understand what those words mean, don't understand what they really mean when you put them all together. So in terms of, first of all, advanced internal data sharing, what's an example of that? What's an example of a company that's not doing effective data sharing internally?
So let me simplify it. Imagine you are in supply chain and you've got a team in marketing. Marketing is generating demand for the organization. You got to make sure you have sufficient supply to be able to convert something or produce something that can actually meet that demand. But what happens when they don't share that particular demand forecast with you? Or what happens if they have no visibility of what your supply base can and cannot do, or what your operational capacity is to actually produce something? And so what happens is a lot of times when we hear the term interoperability, most people go to that from a technological standpoint. But I often say this: interoperability is a social problem. We have built organizational structures that by nature don't like to talk to one another. So effective internal data sharing means this: 1, I have data you want, I have data you need, and more importantly, I have data you trust. And so I call them the data cool kids and the data exiles. In other words, you can have great data, but you're unwilling to share it. You're an exile. You might have terrible data, but you're willing to give it to everyone. You're a data exile. A data cool kid is this data in a good format and structure that I can use. We talk about John Maxwell as a great leader and communicator. And one of the things he says is that the burden is always on the speaker, not on the listener. So when I come to you for data, how often do you give me things that I have to jump through hoops to translate, transform, to understand before I can use it? A good data sharing partner is one who understands the data asset I need, how I'm going to utilize that data asset, and tries to package it in a manner that makes it easier and more straightforward for me to actually start to execute relative to that data. So that's what we mean by advanced and effective internal data sharing, because we'll always say, I'll share data with a customer, or I might share data with a supplier. But the reality is this: if your internal data sharing is poor, your external data sharing is going to be a fallacy.
And liquid data assets?
Yeah, so liquid data assets, think about liquidity from a financial standpoint. It's very similar to this. Is what we're saying is, can that data actually be moved? Can it be easily recombined with other data assets to create a new data asset? Or is it that data in one state rarely evolves to a different state where we can use it for different purposes? So the more liquid a data asset is, the more likely it can be used across the organization, and the more easily with it can be combined with other data.
So why does the healthcare industry, it sounds to me you're especially focused on that because you feel it sort of lags, and probably every industry has ways to go in this area, and being more effective at how they treat their supply chain, how they manage their supply chain, how they view and share their data internally. But it also sounds to me like the industry that maybe lags behind the most and struggles the most with this is the healthcare industry. Why is that?
Part of it, if we're being frank here, although we have great supply chain leaders in many organizations, in the other organizations, the vast majority of your supply chain leaders are there by way of attrition. They grew up in the warehouse. They grew up moving boxes. They may not have been formally trained in the ins and outs of supply chain. They may know one aspect. Maybe they know sourcing. Maybe they know transportation. Maybe they know logistics. But the reality is very few understand supply chains end to end. And thereby what they fail to realize is that in healthcare, you don't have just one type of supply chain. You've got a multitude of supply chains. If I'm a consumer packaged goods, I've got a product-oriented supply chain. If I am a company who does storm damage cleanup, I have a service-oriented supply chain. Unfortunately, in healthcare, you have both. You've got to move products in so that you can provide services. And so you've got to reconcile that. And that means that, so I have to operate differently. I might have a totally different strategy for my outside in supply chain than I do for my inside out. And then the other thing is this: healthcare loves to say they're special because there's always a human on the other end. And I agree that there's a human, there's a life on the other end. But here's the thing: if I'm a Coca-Cola or I'm a Pepsi and I need aluminum for my products, I don't care that I'm competing with a healthcare organization for aluminum, nor do I care that I'm competing with them for plastic. So in healthcare, we have built this notion around us that we're special, we're different, we get special treatment, but supply chains are global. And so what that means is you are a global player, even in a local market. And the vast majority of our leaders have not reconciled that. And so as a result, we don't move our thinking forward. We don't think about innovation. We think about operational excellence rather than saying that it can't always be about keeping the lights on. Sometimes it's about what happens when I don't need the type of lights that I have.
Well, that's a great point. And it makes me think again, going back to the difference between, hiring a consulting firm versus hiring a practitioner who has been there, done that, and, has really understood the deficiencies and actually fix them for some other client. So in healthcare, and maybe in every industry, is AI causing some to actually fall further behind? That meaning that they're so far behind the rest of the people who have gotten the message that AI is almost making them fall even further behind.
Yeah, it is, but maybe not for the reason that a lot of people think. It's not because there's not the capacity or the wherewithal to leverage AI. What it is because we have a leadership base that is closer to retirement. And they're saying, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to take the time to understand it. And I definitely don't want to start a new initiative. And so we're kicking the can down the road for the next leader who comes in with a little more energy and excitement to take this on. But the problem is I may be setting my organization back by a decade. When you look at the rate at which this particular type of technology is advancing and changing, you got 3 more years to retirement. That may be 10 years to take that organization to catch up. And so that's why I believe healthcare is falling behind.
So right now, when you have a healthcare client, hospital network, whatever, that comes to you and says, man, we are behind. Like, we know we're struggling, and we're struggling in a variety of ways. And one of them being our supply chain, our sourcing, procurement, the whole 9 yards. What's the first thing you go in and look at, and what are you looking for?
I'm a firm believer that I need to know where you're trying to go. So here's the thing. I teach a consulting class for MBAs. And one of the things I tell them is this: whenever you get a scope of work from a client, that problem is as the client understands it. It doesn't mean that that's the only problem. Doesn't even mean it's the problem that should be getting their attention. But what I do when I go in is I try to understand why they perceive that to be the issue. But I'm also looking at what are the things on the fringes that they haven't focused on that might be contributing. Because sometimes the problem is not the problem, it's the symptom. And so part of my job is to figure out where you've been, where you are, and where you're trying to go. And then so there's some things, other things that we need to take advantage of, or some things that we need to tackle. And so that's where I start with an organization, because every leader comes in with a vision of what they want to do, but they don't always know how best to do it. And so what I want to do is I want to say, let's take the vision in your head and let's at least be able to write it down in 2 sentences. Because if we can't clearly articulate it in 2 sentences, it's going to be extremely difficult for everyone below you to execute, because you're not going to execute that. You're the dreamer. And that's okay. It's okay to be the dreamer, but someone has to be the doer. So how do I give them something that's abstract that they can then create, convert it into something that's much more systematic, where we can build a process around it? Because if we can build a process, we can repeat it. And that's the key to me, is figuring out, I always say, look at your processes that are routine, that rarely go awry to where they don't require human intervention, and those things that are repeatable. The core of your business, because you should be innovating around your core rather than outsourcing your core. And in healthcare, we do a tremendous amount of outsourcing our core competencies.
When you think about things that you've now, especially in the last couple of years, with so many advancements, especially with AI, if you look back, let's say just the last year, is there anything that stands out that has had a real impact, even on the way you look at sourcing, procurement, supply chain, and how it's going to impact us going forward?
So to answer your question, the things that have surprised me is when I look at the nearly 800 organizations that I have primary data on from a digitalization standpoint, particularly, and not just healthcare, you will be surprised that fewer than a third of these organizations actually have a digital strategy, or more than 95% of them have digital initiatives underway. So how will we know what success looks like? How will we know when we reach the destination? How do we talk about our unique selling proposition if there was never a strategy to guide it? We've been so fixated on not being left behind and things that we see in the headlines that we run headlong into something without fully understanding it. And then now our character is called into question because as a function of, am I willing to admit that we were premature because we didn't understand it? I tell executives this: rash decisions lead to premature endings. Whether it's the ending of your career, whether it's the ending of that initiative, or whether it's the ending of your ability to lead the individuals who now follow you. And so I often say, let's take a step back. Let's make sure we understand it to a bit, because here's the thing: technology is not the silver bullet when it comes to even digital transformation at all. It's going to start with your people. Am I willing to reskill and upskill my people? Am I willing to, I always say, what I want to use AI to do, I want AI to help me reach optimal performance out of my human talent. Because if we're left to our own vices, we're never going to reach our potential because we're easily distracted. So how do I take away those things that distract you and doesn't really require your intellectual capacity to free you up to focus on those things that allow you to tap into your intellectual capabilities?
This has been fascinating, and we've actually gone over, and I thank you for your time. I'm going to ask you, this is my speed round questions, but I'll tell you, man, I think I go back to the beginning of our conversation, and I think it's amazing that you were thinking about this stuff long before I was, for sure, and most of the world. But it's also amazing to me that in my experience and exposure to this, it's still, even after the pandemic, like you said before, I think the chief procurement officers, head supply chain officers, they've gotten a better seat at the table, but so many companies have sort of fallen back into their old ways, and they're not really sourcing, they're just transacting and not really thinking about how do they monetize and how do they really treat their supply chain as an asset. So here's my speed round questions. Which emerging technology or trend is going to have the biggest impact and on which industry the soonest?
For me, no doubt, is generative AI. And when we look at industries, I don't think there's any industry in which that's not going to have a tremendous transformation.
And I had an answer to that question. Someone said transportation was going to be the one that was going to be impacted the most, with autonomous vehicles and also with autonomous, tractor trailers and whatnot. I was like,
yeah, I don't see that happening in the short term. And I'll tell you why. Primarily, it's because of regulations, and the regulatory body does not move quickly enough. It's not that the technology is not there. It's just that we don't have the freedom to leverage the technology that's there.
So what's your one piece of advice that when you're with a sourcing and procurement leader, supply chain leader, and you can only give them one piece of advice, what's the most important thing you tell them?
Solve tomorrow's problem today.
Skate to where the puck is going, not where it is right now.
Not where it is.
Yeah. How do you measure success in the world that you live when it comes to whether or not something, a company has an effective supply chain or not, and they're treating it as an asset? How do you measure that?
Success in that regard is when I look at the stakeholders, both internal and external. Have I made their lives better? Have I made their jobs easier? And have I had a demonstrative impact on something that society can benefit from?
That's awesome. So I want to ask you this last question, because I have found in my various conversations this to be super interesting. I talked to quite a few people, and especially the ones at the larger companies. I talked to one chief procurement or head of supply chain at a Fortune 100 company, and talking about hiring some military people or people with military backgrounds, because the amount of wargaming they're doing now and planning and contingency planning is 10 times what it used to be. And especially with AI, I spoke with another big company, and they were telling me how they had forecasted, using AI, the shortage of eggs and cocoa. And they were ahead of it by a year. And I was fascinated by that. Talk about risk management in the world that you live in. And do you think, what improvements do you think need to be done there?
Yeah, a lot of times we think about risk management in the context of resilience and agility. The challenge that I've seen is that in most organizations, risk management is not a core business practice. It's what we call upon and what we do in times of turmoil, trouble, or disaster. But what we have to understand is this: the changing landscape is this: supply chain disruptions are the norm. They are no longer an afterthought or something that happens. It's not the exception. But what we have to do is, if we have to have risk management practices and capabilities and guidelines that ensure that a supply chain disruption does not lead to a business interruption. So we can still move forward in the face of the disruption because we anticipate it and we have mechanisms in place to be able to navigate regardless.
Randy, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it. And I hope my listeners enjoyed it also. I'm sure they have. And I really look forward to keeping in touch with you. So thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
And to everybody watching and listening, thanks for joining. Again, my name is John Pavi, and this has been Smarter Sourcing. We'll see you on the next episode.